lucky to go there, I think.
Mm. Was that just as a young you were a student?
10th, 11th, 12th grade.
Right.
Oh.
Welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Joel Cohen. And Dr. Cohen's at the Rockefeller University now, and he's the head of the laboratories on populations at the Rockefeller University, and more relevant, perhaps directly to what we want to support and or talk about today and let people know about, is a book that he's recently published, which is called "How Many People Can the Earth Support?" And it's a really very relevant and important book that we want to let people know. And Dr. Cohen, welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you, Harold.
I wonder maybe you could. You have a number of the book we want to talk about, but I wonder maybe you could share your own background. I asked you just as we were coming on camera what your own academic background is. Maybe you could do that for us if you would, because there's a strong component of statistical analysis and so forth that's involved. There's a wider perspective as well. Maybe you could share a little of your own background, then we can get into the meat and substance of the book and the issue itself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was an undergraduate in mathematics, and I was interested in biology, and I was trying to decide what species to study.
Yes.
And when I graduated from college, I got a fellowship from my university, which gave me a year to travel around the world by myself. The rules were I couldn't take courses. I just had to keep moving. And it was just enough money to go second class. So I found out what life is really like.
You didn't stay at the five-star hotel?
No, sir.
Yes.
I stayed in the cheapest places I could find, and I took second-class trains. And I saw that a very large part of the world is poor, very poor.
Very poor.
Very poor.
Yeah.
And that there were children who were not getting a fair shake in life. Mm-hmm. I remember in East Africa, I got out of a vehicle and little kids ran up to me and they were sort of staring up at me. And I looked down into their faces and they had flies walking around in their eyes. Mm-hmm. And they didn't even try to brush them away.
Yeah.
And that's because the flies were there all the time.
Yeah.
And I knew that those flies carried an infectious disease called trachoma.
Yes, indeed.
Which can be treated if you have the medicine. It can be treated. But these kids didn't have the medicine, and I didn't have it. Mm-hmm. And I knew that those kids, in the matter somewhere between months and years, would be blinded by that trachoma. Yeah. And it was a wrenching experience.
Yes.
To see people who didn't get educated, they didn't have enough food from the time they were born, they didn't have opportunities, and they weren't being taken care of the way a child ought to be taken care of.
Yeah, with things that are so simple and easy and inexpensive, very often like a shot or something can protect
that's
people.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. And
immunizations and things. Yeah.
And when I was in Calcutta, I remember I came out of a train station. It was a hot, sunny day with dust all over the place. And I came out of the train station, and there were people lying on the ground, covered by light gray cloths. Mm-hmm. And they were covered with dust, and they weren't moving. And I was met by my Indian host, and I asked him if those people were alive or dead. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Oh, don't worry. If they don't move for 3 days, the station master has them carted away."
Incredible, yeah.
Well, I didn't find that very reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw poverty of a kind that I have just, never seen before, had never seen before.
And that had a strong personal effect.
It had a tremendous wrenching effect on my view of most people's lives in the world. And later I learned, numbers to put on this experience. I learned that, today, for 4.5 billion people out of our 5.7 billion total, the average annual income is $1,000. That's total income. Mm-hmm. And I learned that for 2 billion people, the world's poorest 2 billion, the average annual income is $400 or $1 a day.
Yes.
And on that, people can't eat, people can't have much of what it really means to be a human being, which is to participate in the past and to have a meaningful role in a social life, and to to be intact as a human being.
And that had a personal effect on you and affected what you wanted to do academically
Very
and
much.
in a sense with the rest of your life.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when I came back to school after that year, I had already decided to do a doctorate in mathematics, and I did that.
Yes.
And then I went on and I did another doctorate in public health, tropical public health, population sciences.
I see.
Because
right.
then I wanted to be able to do something related to the well-being of people. So the species I chose to study is us.
Homo sapiens sapiens.
Yeah, Homo
right.
sapiens. We call ourselves the wise,
ones.
although we don't often act like that.
Yeah.
That was my choice as
Yeah.
a result of that.
And you've also written a very large tablet, and you have an anecdote, or you have a reference in your book to Calcutta and New York and
Right.
other things. The book is very interesting book, highly recommended. But you
Thank
took
you.
this subject, and you also took a very large tableau because you're looking at the population and how many people can the Earth support brings into, and here we're talking coming up toward the Earth Day season and so forth. It's very appropriate because you're looking at these questions which are fundamental to an understanding ecological and so forth. But I'm wondering maybe, and also you take a historical frame of reference, and you also take a future-oriented frame of reference.
Right.
It's almost a systems overview that you have necessarily to study this. And I wonder, maybe we could begin at the beginning in a certain sense. Homo sapiens sapiens, they tell us if the mitochondrial DNA is correct and so forth. We got started maybe a couple 100,000 years ago out of Africa and so forth. And you have these incredible figures. Perhaps you have them in your head.
Yes.
But that it took all from the beginning of time, 4.5 billion years, or what, for us to get to where at the time of Christ there were maybe a quarter of a billion. But maybe you could go through that.
Sure.
The pace at which the population increase on the planet Earth, and give us a historical perspective on that, if you could.
Well, let me go back a little bit further. The last ice age ended about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and people at that time numbered about 5 million. So roughly 5 to 6 million. We don't know with much precision.
I was going to ask you, how can we know?
Well, we estimate between 2 million and 20 million, but our estimates are based on population density today among people who live by hunting and gathering.
I see.
We make an extrapolation. Just a guess, basically.
Yes.
So let's say 5 or 6 million.
Worldwide.
Total worldwide. So that's less than the population of New York City.
Yes.
The population doubled every 16 or 17 centuries for several millennia, until by the time of Christ, the population had risen to about 250 million. And again, the real numbers are between 100 million and 350 million. We don't know. But let's say roughly the population of the United States today.
That's very interesting. And do we have an idea of the spread of the population then? I mean, it would have been, we had
by that time there
Mesopotamia and that sort of thing. But
there were big populations in Asia, big populations, relatively big, in South Asia and East Asia, in the Middle East, and beginning to spread up into Europe. And in Mesopotamia, those basically the population.
And we probably had considerable population growth down in Mesoamerica and perhaps in the Andean by then, or not?
There was population
civilizations that were developed
yes,
in there,
but
there had been a Neolithic development.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly how many we don't know for sure.
Okay, fine. But it took that time, from the beginning of time, to get 250 million people at the time of Christ. Million people at the time of Christ, right.
Population of the U.S., think of it.
All right.
Which today is about 4 or 5% of the world's population. So the next doubling continued at the same pace between the time of Christ and 1650. The population doubled from 250 million to 500 million. And then around that time, the New World and the Old World started to exchange foods, like corn came to the Old World.
Yeah, after Columbus.
Right. And people started going from the Old World to the New World, and ideas and resources, and as a result, the population began to accelerate tremendously. Nutrition improved in the Old World, and the Old World experienced the early rise of population So that the next doubling, instead of taking 16 or 17 centuries, took place in under 200 years, under 2 centuries.
Incredible.
So the change was, we went from 500 million people in 1650s to around 1 billion in 1830.
In a mere 200 years.
200
or so.
years, right.
Yeah.
And then the pace, with improvements in sanitation and the Industrial Revolution, the pace picked up even more. Another doubling from 1 billion to 2 billion only took a century. And so by 1930, we had about 2 billion people on the planet.
Incredible.
And then the pace picked up even further, and between 1930 and 1974, in 44 years, we had another doubling. So we passed
mackerel.
4 billion around 1974. If you look back from where we are now, the most recent doubling has occurred in just 40 years. So anybody on the planet who is 40 years old or older has lived through a doubling of population. And that is what is unprecedented.
Absolutely.
Because never before the second half of the 20th century had any human being lived through a doubling of the human population. And anybody who has lived since 1920 has lived through a tripling of the human population. There just is no previous experience with that. Another way to look at it is in terms of absolute increase. It took from the beginning of time to 1830 to put the first billion people on the planet, as I mentioned. The most recent billion people have taken only 12 years to be added.
That's staggering. And I'm wondering, what have we got a good idea of the rate of the increase? How has that? Has it consistently gone up? What is it now? And in a percentage terms.
Yes.
Could you address that?
Yeah. Yes. Well, the rate of increase has steadily increased, with the exception of catastrophes like the plague that swept Europe and the Middle East in the 14th century. So there was a little crash. But since that time, in the last 6 centuries, the global population growth rate has steadily crept upward. And the big change came at World War II. Before World War II, the growth rate had never exceeded 1% a year.
Even that on a worldwide scale.
Worldwide basis. We're not talking about individual countries because there have been a lot of fluctuation.
Yes.
But on a worldwide scale, 1% a year had never been attained globally before World War II. After World War II, the rich countries of the world learned how to export health without exporting wealth. And as a consequence, the death rates of children mainly, but death rates of all ages in the poor countries dropped very dramatically.
Infant mortality.
Infant mortality
and
fell.
that's what had kept the pace down throughout the millennia.
Right, exactly. Right. A high level of infant mortality had been matched by a high level of fertility. After World War II, the mortality dropped, and the difference between birth rates and death rates was the growth rate. And the growth rate just shot way up.
To what kind of figures have we looked at in that time?
Right. It grew to about 2.1% a year at the all-time peak, which was around 1965 to 70. That is when the human species reached its highest growth rate in all of its history. 2.1%, which is a doubling time of about 33 years. Short, very short doubling time.
Yeah.
And at that time, the human species turned a corner.
Yes.
And we became the first species, probably in all of evolution, voluntarily to control our own fertility and get control of ourselves and slowly bring our growth rate down. Fertility has been falling since then, not evenly, not uniformly. It dropped for about 10 years, and then for another 15 years it was completely flat, and then recently it's begun to come down again. So
it's starting to come down.
It is starting to come down.
It is, okay.
We can't really predict very well because the world's growth rate is determined by decisions made by billions of couples in the bedroom.
Absolutely.
And this is a human issue. It's not some abstract theoretical thing. It's a decision made by all of us jointly.
All right, just to round that out, we're now in 1996, what would the rate now be, the estimate of increase on a world scale be now?
We are growing roughly about 1.6% a year. That's, if that were maintained, that would be sufficient to double the population in 43 years.
That's staggering.
It is staggering.
And it begins, it's building on itself, and of course it was, we want to go back to some of the popular things. Mr. Malthus had pointed out that, you know, there's a geometric progression, or at least this is the way it was presented, of population with the arithmetic progression of the means of support of that. And he said that's, you know, the Malthusian view of the world is one that was very negative and very glum.
Right.
And perhaps as, you know, you've seen. And you know, this is something that's been addressed. Throughout, if we get some sort of an idea, if we were to talk about generations, what the average lifespan has been as we project, and what the implications are. That was a very interesting thing you said, where we exported health without exporting wealth, which is an interesting thing. But give us some idea of what, when we say a generation, are we talking maybe perhaps like 20 years, 30 years, or what has constituted a generation throughout most of that period of time, and what has happened to the lifespan of the population, and what are the implications seeking to grow?
Well, those are two slightly different questions.
Yes.
Generation length is sort of, what's the average time from the birth of a child to the average birth in the next, average birth by that person. And that's more or less on the order of quarter of a century, 20 to 25 years. That hasn't varied a great deal. There are trends towards earlier marriage or towards later marriage in different countries, but that is more or less around 20 to 25 years. The huge change that has happened is the increase in life expectancy. Life expectancy simply means it's the average number of years that a newborn infant will live. That's what life expectancy is. At the beginning of this century, so 1900, life expectancy worldwide was around 40 years. 40 years. That's the average. In the U.S., we were better off than most. It was around 45.
Only at the turn of this century.
That's right. If you look back, the life expectancy in the United States at the turn of the century is what was lower than it is in the poorer parts of the world today. Now the global life expectancy is about 65. It has. It has grown. The life expectancy has grown by the length of a generation. It's a remarkable achievement. But that really conceals two different worlds. And in fact, all of these global statistics conceal two different worlds. In the rich world, the life expectancy is in the middle 70s, and it's around 75 or so in the United States, something like that. And in the poor world, it's in the middle 50s. So we have two different sets of conditions. In fact, can I tell you a story about that?
By all means.
Well, this story is about a ecologist and an economist and a statistician who went on a deer hunt with bow and arrow. And they were creeping through the undergrowth when suddenly they spied a deer. So the economist took careful aim with the bow and fired. And the arrow landed 5 meters to the right of the deer. And then the ecologist took careful aim and fired, and the arrow landed 5 meters to the left of the deer. So the statistician looked at both arrows and looked at the deer and said, "We got it, we got it."
Put it in the middle, right?
Well, hunting deer with the average arrow is like hunting the truth about the world with global statistics. In fact, there really are two worlds. There's about 1.2 billion people living in the rich world, and their average income is about $17,000 a year. And then there are the other 80%. That's 4.5 billion people, and their income is about $1,000 a year. And so to talk about a rising average overlooks the fact that the rich fraction of the world has been getting a steadily increasing share of the world's economic pie, while the poor part has been getting a steadily decreasing part. And so we have to be very careful, when we use global statistics. They're convenient handles, but they don't capture the fact that, for example, the population is growing by 90 million a year. 90 to 90, yeah, roughly. 90 to 95% of that population growth is in the countries that are poorest, that have the least means to give every child a good life. And only a small fraction of that is in the rich countries.
If we go to the rich countries, what kind, the rich countries, Europe, Japan, the Tiger Nations, the United States, North America,
Australia,
New Zealand, and that. What is the rate of increase that we see there, and what is the tendency there, and how does it differ with the, as you put it, the poor, and
yes.
we're taking a
yes.
oversimplified, but a two-tiered society on the
right.
world, and we are coming increasingly into a global village where these things are impinging on each other in a global economy. But could you make that differentiation as far as population is concerned?
Yes. The rich, 1.2 billion, are increasing in numbers at about 0.2% of 1% a year.
2/10.
A better way to think about that is the doubling time is about 430 years. Very slow at the present rate,
yes.
4 centuries, okay? And the poor world is growing at about 1.9% a year, almost 10 times faster, with a doubling time, when you convert it that way, 36 years. So it's roughly 10 times faster. That's a huge difference.
Sure is.
It means that the poor countries have to double their supply of schools if they're going to keep the same class sizes and the same technology for education in just 36 years. They have to double their supply of hospitals if they're going to have the same kind of infrastructure there. They're running hard just to keep in place because the population is growing so rapidly.
If we look over the long haul, the human experience, and we had, like we mentioned, Paleolithic times, and agriculture came, and then there was increased, and then we get into the Industrial Revolution, and as you see, you have these differences of attitude, apparently, in terms of the developed nations, that with the industrialization process, with the economic development process, that people, without coercion, I presume, have decided or opted for smaller, reasonable sized families in terms of, it would seem, the needs of the earth in a sustainable pattern. But people traditionally in the agricultural economies where they had high infant mortality and so forth had larger families because in the traditional pattern, which held for those who were in now the well-developed part of the world until relatively recently as well, so many of the infants perished. And it was a genetic thing in order to sustain the genetic representation of themselves. They had to have those in order to increase their, to maintain their genetic lineage, as it were, in a certain sense. Is that part of the explanation, or how do we understand the difference between the attitude of people that have very large, 10, 12 children perhaps, in the less developed world, let's say, and then the tendency through time? Didn't they used to have larger families in the developed world as well?
Certainly did.
Or in North America? Could you address that dynamic?
Yeah. Well, let me be honest.
Yes.
I'll tell you what I know, but what I know is incomplete because this is a very complicated subject.
Certainly is.
That the scholars who have devoted their lives to it don't understand fully.
All right.
So I'm giving you the best understanding that I have, but I think we have a lot to learn about
yes,
this.
I understand, yeah.
People who are farmers can readily use the help of children from an early age to do farm chores. And people who grew up on farms in the United States had to do farm chores from the time they were kids. That's why our school system has summer vacations, because the kids were needed to go work on the farms. And that has been true throughout the ages. So children in a farming community, children are an asset. When people move to cities, there's no farm work to be done, and the kids have to go to school very often. And when the kids are in school, they're not earning. They're not producing, they're not helpful labor. So the motion from a rural setting to an urban setting often produces a change in the value of a child economically. It becomes, a child changes from being a productive asset to a consumptive liability. Now, that's not the whole story, but it is part of the story.
We did have children working in the mills that Blake talked about
Right.
and so forth.
Absolutely.
Child labor.
Absolutely.
So it was a social revolution.
And let me give another complicating factor. In France, in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, the peasants began to reduce their fertility because they didn't want to divide up their land holdings among many sons. In those days, it was the sons who inherited.
They had primogeniture.
Right.
Yeah.
They wanted to keep the land for, well, sometimes they would divide it up, sometimes it would go to the eldest son.
Yeah.
But if the other sons had to leave, they would go to the cities, and then they had reduced fertility. But in a peasant system where people divide up the land, that's also can be an incentive for lower fertility. Now, the present state of the world is that 74% of the rich world lives in cities, almost 3/4. But in the poor world, only 35% of the population lives in cities. That means that 2 out of 3 people in the poor world are still peasants living on the land. And that is a huge difference in the incentives for having or not having additional children. So that's a very basic fact.
Yeah, well, and it's one that surely closes up statistic in terms of statistics that shows up. Is it generally fair to say that these are all layman's kind of percepts and so forth, but the industrialization process, the development process, the generating of wealth and the improvement of living standard and so forth results in, or tends to result in, we would say, people on their own, and we haven't gone to coercive patterns and so forth, but on their own opting to have smaller families. The better off they are, the more they tend to opt to have smaller families.
In general, as a historical generalization, that's fine. That's true, because in Europe and in the parts of the world that are now wealthy, there was industrialization at the same time that there was a gradual decline in fertility. And that is not the whole story. There are also circumstances where investments have been made in the education and health of women, and where the economy is still very poor, but fertility has fallen. So sometimes there are other factors in addition to industrialization that can lead people to lower fertility. That's saying that industrialization seems to have made the difference for the wealthy countries, for us, but it's not clear that all countries have to follow the same path to attain a lower level of fertility.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as we go through, we went through an industrial revolution, and we're now, some people say we're going through an information-based quantum new development. Some people, Marshall McLuhan used to observe that the developing world might be able to leapfrog the satanic mills that Blake and others talked about in some of the worst aspects of industrialization. And there's a development. In general, the better off or the more economically secure the people are, we perceive that they tend on their own to opt for having these fewer families.
Yes.
And it's
fewer
obvious.
children, yes.
And it's fewer children. And it is obvious from these growth rates, and in a certain sense, the title of your book is, after all, How Many People Can the Earth Support? That it would be unsustainable at a certain rate if it continues to rise at some rate. So this is a major problem confronting the Earth in a sustainable pattern and so forth.
I would just add that it's clear that wealth alone is not sufficient to lower fertility. There are oil-producing countries where the average income is higher than in the United States, and yet where the average family size, that is the average number of children per woman, is 6, 7, and 8. And that reflects the cultural role that women have in those countries, which is limited to childbearing and homemaking. So that today it seems clear that if women have more options, such as education, employment, other activities outside of the home, those other options compete with childbearing and may result in lower fertility. But if those options are cut off, even when there's wealth, if women are expected to be only bearers of children, they may continue to have high fertility. So the cultural role of women makes a tremendous difference. And let me just support that with, again, some global statistics. I mentioned before that the population growth rate peaked around 1965 and has been slowly, erratically declining since then. In 1970, for every 100 men who were either in jobs or looking for work, there were about 37 women who were in jobs or looking for paid work outside the home. That's economically active.
Yes.
In only 20 years, the number of women economically active per 100 economically active men rose from 37 to 62.
Wow.
Almost a doubling.
Yes.
So I don't think it's a coincidence that while fertility was going down, economic activity of women was going up. I think they are linked. And as a matter of equity and self-interest, it's good for women to have more options. It makes a huge difference to what they choose to do with their lives.
Do you think it makes a difference that we have now R486 or something, and we have other kinds of ways, so that the ability, just physically, the ability to control population is this an important question?
Are you speaking
birth control
486,
mechanism?
the French so-called abortion pill?
Yeah, right. Or other systems, the ease with which this process can be, realized.
Yes, I think that modern contraceptive methods are an important factor, and making them easily available to people is an aspect of individual liberty. It gives people options, and in that sense, choices. Yeah, I am in favor of people having these options and influence over the courses of their own lives. Having the contraceptive services and information and health care available is a good thing in itself, in my view, my opinion. But I don't think it's completely sufficient, because people have to want to change their family sizes. And again, going back to the French peasants in the 18th century, they were able to do so with absolutely no technology whatsoever.
Okay.
So when people choose to change their fertility, if their motivation is strong enough, they can. The role that modern contraceptives play is to make it easier for people to jump that barrier. And I have to say that there's room for great improvement. Our contraceptive methods do fail and are probably not as perfect for use as we could hope.
Okay, well, that's one of the components of that. Another thing one wonders about is this the process of development, the economic opportunities, as you put it, that women have and so forth in the developmental process. Whether we're now confronted in a society where we have this technological development, almost like a locomotive that's coming, the microprocessor and other kinds of things. Some people see the displacement of labor in the working out of the economics of the modern society, that we've had this tremendous tendency, maybe it's just a passing phase or something some people like to think, but this tendency of downsizing, of having people laid off from work. The work enterprise itself is becoming less and less secure for greater numbers of people, even within the middle classes, the striving classes that were of the developed world itself. And at the same time, the technological ability and knowledge base that we have abstractly to provide for the people of the world, to fight trachoma and other things, new green revolutions and other kinds of abilities, that we have this tremendous capability of providing life support for the population, that there is that if they get to a point where they that there could be seen that we're gaining on our ability to provide, to where Bucky Fuller, for instance, used to talk about how we may actually be able to see that collectively, in a systems way, that we have the ability to make what he called the earth work, if we have the appropriate ability to to utilize with good design what our knowledge base tells us we're capable of doing in an interrelated, sustainable way with this spaceship Earth of ours. If we reach a point where we have that capability, and that people could be engaged in what might be thought of over the long haul in what would have been like leisured activities of the way that the citizens of Periclean Greece had the ability to do that, and so that they could have real choiceful lives, as you put it, in terms of a wide variety of abilities, and they would not be under the iron gun of necessity, of striving, and so forth. So that, in a sense, that would be an almost perhaps utopian kind of view one might see. We've had it over the age, that we could be successful as a planet. Do you think if we reach that point, is that a desirable position for us we would aspire to that people could be able to maximize their sense of participation in terms of their own ability to provide, to contribute to the human activity and so forth, that if they have free choice within a non-alienated environment, that is, that they're secure in their own being and secure in in the broader sense of their own being, that is something that seems to be, by these statistics of economic development, desirable. But is it perhaps that the potential adverse side of that, if people are truly secure and they're not alienated positions in industrialization process where they're out there doing those jobs because they have to, they're being driven to that, or being lured, they would rather have a Buick than a baby. And that industrialization process is really a sign of an alienated kind of stance toward the broader society, if you understand what I'm saying. And it's an interrelated question. But if we reach a sustainable position of allowing for people to be able to be, in a certain sense, liberated from the constraints of the scourges over the millennia, do you think that it might be that from a position of relative security, of material security, that people would opt to have large families? Because, after all, children really are a delightful aspect of one's living the good life, as it were. Can you understand? So
yes.
that we have to keep people alienated in order for them to...
No, I don't.
Or could you, do you understand the question, what I'm getting at, and can you address it?
It's a very complex and difficult question.
Yeah.
Okay. I think well, there are a couple of things I'd like to comment on. One is, you mentioned the insecurity of workers in this country about their jobs and downsizing. And there are competing theories about why that's happening. One is that it's technological change, as you mentioned. Another, which is simply making it possible to produce the same goods with fewer people at work.
That's right.
Another is that the jobs are moving out of the country. And I think people don't appreciate that low-skilled jobs, which used to provide an exit from poverty for people who lived in inner cities, have left the country to the maquiladoras of Mexico and to the workers of China and to the workers of Asia all over the place and outside of the country. They've left because the price of labor there is cheap, and people will work for 1/10 of the salaries that they work for in the United States. And the reason labor is cheap there is that population growth is rapid.
Right.
And so there's a connection between the exit of jobs from inner cities and rapid population growth in the developing countries. So actually, the workers of the United States have a stake in slower population growth rates in the world. Their own jobs are at stake. And that is not something that they seem to have recognized very widely. The unions should be on this. They should be saying, smaller families protect your job. And they do. Smaller families worldwide protect jobs. But the only response, one response is therefore to promote education worldwide to slow fertility. And the second is to upgrade the education of our own American workers so that they are technologically able to compete. I was once on a plane going out to the West Coast, and seated to my right was a Mr. Rao from India. And I asked him, what do you do, Mr. Rao? Well, he lives in Bombay, and he manages 500 computer programmers who work for Citibank. And he was flying from Bombay to Portland, Oregon to install a new software system. Now, the customers in Portland have no clue that their software is written by highly intelligent, highly skilled, and poorly paid programmers in Bombay.
And Bangalore is emerging. Yeah.
And Bangalore.
Mm.
And so it's not only the industrial jobs that are going out of the country. Those 500 programmers are not Americans, but Indians. And so the intellectual middle-class jobs are going out. And when those jobs go, the managers go too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Mr. Rao is from Bombay.
Mm-hmm.
So that downsizing is connected with the rapid growth of an intelligentsia outside of our borders.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to compete globally. I'm saying they're a platitude, obvious.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to give this, that rapid population growth is a problem for the United States. And people haven't awakened to that problem. There's another part of your question, and that was, suppose everybody becomes wealthy, will they then choose to have children?
That would be if we find some way of not only exporting health, but exporting wealth to the people
Right.
of the world.
Yes.
And we solve this economic conundrum that our policymakers seem not to be able to deal with. But you understand,
I understand
in a larger
yeah.
scenario of understanding.
And I have to say, from my point of view, that is essentially an unanswerable question.
Okay.
What choices will be made? I have 2 children. I have a 19-year-old daughter. I have a 16-year-old son. They won't tell me how many children they're going to have, probably because they don't know. And if you find out, would you please call me collect?
Yeah, right. That would be that's one of the major questions that is there. Whether
We
can afford to be successful, or we must keep ourselves alienated.
Yeah. But let me come back to another aspect. Since Earth Day is coming up soon,
Yes, it is.
I've been talking about humans as if we lived on this planet by ourselves. That is not the case. And along with the 5.7 billion people that we have on the planet now, we have 4.3 billion large domestic animals: sheep, goats, cattle, zebras, camel, buffalo. 4.3 billion. They outweigh the human population.
Interesting.
In addition to that, we have 17 billion chickens, about 3 chickens per person. That number of chickens has more than doubled in the last 10 years. So if you look over the last 20 years average, the amount of grain that those domestic animals consume is about 40% of all grain that's consumed. So for every 3 pounds of grain that goes into a human mouth, we feed another 2 pounds of grain to our domestic animals. It's as if our 6 billion people are being followed around by a shadow 4 billion people in the form of animals consuming grain along with us. Those animals are displacing, in many cases, other species that are less transparently useful to the human species. So we are having a tremendous impact on species around the Earth, and that requires serious attention.
Yeah, and that isn't to mention the natural fauna and flora of the world, the broader ecological question of this spaceship Earth, and you know, we come to a period. You talk about how we want to talk about these questions of population increase. You say population, and that you might be able to create a tetrahedron of understanding where the population is at the top, and then on the 3 sides you have environment, culture, and economics.
Correct.
And I wonder, maybe you could discuss that, because all of these things are cultural laden questions, and probably ultimately come around to that question I asked you about what happens if we make it, as Bucky Fuller would have said.
Yes.
Maybe you could address that tetrahedron, if you could.
Well, I have this, you know, I can't remember too much.
Yeah.
I've got a limited mind, okay?
Thank gosh we have computers.
Right, well, but what I try to do, when I think about the population problem, I try not to think about it in isolation, but I think about it in connection with 3 other things that you mentioned. One is economics, a second is culture, and a third is the environment. And we simply cannot isolate any 3, 2, or 1 of those factors. They go together. A lot of people talk about population and development. but they leave out the fact that development depends on the quality of the environment and on the soundness of the culture and institutions and legal setup and politics, all of those things that go under the heading of culture. Some people talk about population and the environment, but again, you can't talk about that without referring to the economic system, which gives people incentives for behaving in certain ways. So a few people talk about population, economics, and the environment, but again, culture is an absolutely central factor. And let me give a concrete example. This is a cotton shirt. You might be wearing a cotton shirt. I don't know.
I think so.
To grow 1 pound of cotton in Oklahoma irrigated agriculture takes about 29,000 pounds of water. So the water demand of cotton is really immense. On the other hand, rayon is made from cellulose, which is normally extracted from oat hulls. And oat hulls are a discarded byproduct of grains that are raised to feed cattle. So the water requirements for rayon the extra water requirements are very, very small compared to cotton. So in something as simple as choice of fabric, we place different demands on the environment. And that runs through all of our choices, whether people choose to have Jaguars with a capital J or Jaguars with a little j, whether people choose to have freedom to reproduce or freedom of their children to eat. These are choices that we make.
Yeah, well, that's again back to that ultimately choice. These are become choice. Some countries, China became pretty strident in terms of, you know, some quasi or real coercion that they had to exert and so forth. But, you know, and it's also a pattern that here we come to this time of some sort of some people see an existential kind of problem. I don't know, people may have seen that throughout the millennia, that they lived in times of qualitative change, but it does seem in a certain sense that we may be at a major testing period. And at the same time that we can see some of these negative projections, if these population statistics and the environmental situation, we could reach a point of no return in a certain sense. But at the same time, we live at a time of what of our technological knowledge base. We've just discovered the helix of the, you know, we're just discovering almost exponentially new discoveries in the knowledge of what is there, and also the what might be called the ability of having, with elegance of design, being able to do more with less and exploit, in a certain sense, resources that we've not had available to us traditionally. We don't depend on coal necessarily. And
that's right.
They had this thing of Patterson engine where they might be able to get engine, you know, energy, and we might, or the silicon chip itself, or silicon, and some of these new materials, and some of the possibilities of doing with the knowledge base, being able to do more and more with less and less, and provide a better living standard without polluting and degrading the environment in a way that traditionally has just not been available to us. We didn't have the knowledge base. Is there hope in that?
I believe so. I believe so strongly. In the last 20 years, the energy use per person in the United States has dropped by 4%. And the energy use per dollar of GNP has dropped by 27%.
Really?
So there are dramatic falls in the amount of energy that we have to consume to get a certain economic level of well-being.
Okay, we have a drop in the energy or the use of resources, but we have a greater efficiency, so that we, in a certain sense, may, and this may be something, we may be able to have our cake and eat it too, in a certain sense, or I don't want to stray into irrational territory here.
No,
but
I think if we choose the right kinds of cake, we can have quite a lot of them and enjoy it.
Right.
But talking about what's happening in the United States doesn't tell you the larger picture. The larger picture is that energy use per person on a global scale has increased 19-fold since 1860. Between 1860 and 1991, the amount of energy that each person uses has grown up about 19-fold, while the population size has grown up about 5-fold. So the aggregate energy that we are using has increased about 95-fold in about 130 years.
Mm-hmm.
That is a staggering, staggering change in the human ability to control, mess up, or beautify, either way,
yeah.
the planet. And the developing countries, the poor countries, are in the phase now of aggressively increasing the amount of energy used per person, while some of the developed countries like the U.S. and Western Europe are gradually dropping.
I'm wondering whether some of the advantages of good design and understanding and using knowledge base and so forth is perhaps more rapidly exportable to a whole world scenario, so that the advantages and the learning and the knowledge base that could be operated effectively, if we had the right understanding and,
Right.
and with good design, that we might be able to, in a sense, again, I don't want to repair to Bucky, but it is, after all, Earth Day, as he put it, make it in terms of this existential challenge that we confront. It's a race of knowledge and ability to operate appropriately.
And of institutions.
And with the institutional lag that is often there. And as you say, with the economic assumptions. I'm back again to your very apt analogy of exporting health without exporting wealth.
Right.
And we live in this world where the injustice or unjust situation is one that, unfortunately, or do you feel it is that we're on the course of solving that elemental problem, or is that an elemental problem that has to be dealt with if the population problem is to be dealt with? Because those people in Bangalore are going to join the upper elite group, and you're still going to have the mass of people in the same problem.
Well, I think they have to be dealt with together. I think justice and giving people control over their own fertility go together. And, you know, when I cross Fifth Avenue at rush hour, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm just plain careful. Okay? I know that if I step out without looking, I'm going to get clobbered by a taxi. But if I wait for the light and I go when things are okay, I can get across the street fine. Same thing about the future. I am neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I believe that if we devise just institutions, and if the rich world recognizes that our well-being depends on the well-being of the poor world, and it does, because we share the same planet, we share the same atmosphere. If they put carbon dioxide into it, it's our carbon dioxide.
It's an ecological world we live in.
It's one system that interacts. So if we take account of our stake in the well-being of the developing countries, and if we make energy-efficient technologies available and help developing countries to educate their own people so that they develop their own energy-efficient technologies, I think we can make it. But for me, a key is to give the developing countries the ability to make their own way. Not for us to do it for them. We can't. There are just 4 times as many of the poor people as there are of the rich people. What we can do is educate everybody in the world and give people the power to direct their own lives.
And also, if I may, is not only the break between geographically, but between the well-to-do and those who are not. If you're in a two-tiered view of the world with these understandings and so forth, that we come up with some sort of a policy or some sort of a direction that is going to address that question of, are we or are we not being fully able to utilize what it is we're technologically capable of doing? Do we allow capital formation shortfalls to get in the way of what we're capable of doing in terms of infrastructure needs? Do we have a pattern that suits the future rather than being mired to the institutional systems that we have from the past? And this question is a broader question, is it not? In terms of not only does technology that comes available to us with the knowledge growth, but also that we have to have policy and political and economic leadership that can understand that we're coming into some sort of a new condition, which, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like on a world scale that yet has been grasped. And the vision thing, as people will talk about, that there are people of vision who see some effective and appropriate alternative to the way we've done things is needed or not? Or can we muddle through, as the British say, do you think, in terms of the institutions that we have inherited? Or would you think that we need some sort of a vision that would bring some new way of operating this system in order for us to, as you put it, or Bucky Fuller would have put it, to make it beyond this existential challenge that confronts us?
We need both. We need both visions and modeling. Visions may be compelling, but they may be wrong.
All right.
So we don't want to do a global experiment that's a mistake.
All right.
The advantage of modeling is there are lots of different competing ideas, and if we do lots of local experiments, some of them are going to work and some of them aren't. There are, I believe, real grounds for optimism. The Montreal Protocol to regulate chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere showed that when countries see a threat to their well-being, they can come together and do things about it. I think we are developing trade regimes that are setting a new level of integration of the world economy. It has become unfashionable to attack your neighbor and militarily. And even though there are an increasing number of civil wars, on a global scale, the number of wars between countries has been dropping. And so when I'm optimistic, when I'm feeling things are going well, I'm hopeful about the future in that way.
Yeah, and okay, and there's absolutely grounding principle that has to be dealt with is the question: how many people can the Earth support? And let people see this book again. This book is an absolutely grounding question that has to be dealt with by anyone concerned with it. And this has been just recently put out by our guest, is Joel Cohen. Again, he's at the Rockefeller University, head of the Laboratory of Populations at Rockefeller University, is the author of this book. And I thank you really very, very much for coming and talking about this interrelated problem, which it indeed is. It's an interrelated problem and a systems problem, and one that has to be understood. And Dr. Cohen, thank you very, very much for coming in. I really appreciate very much all your work over the years. And we've only just begun to tap the surface of what a great deal of this really very interesting research that you've gone into in terms of the book. And I congratulate you very much.
Thank you, Harold. I've enjoyed being with you.
Not at all. It's been my pleasure. And we in Conversation invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular program. Again, Dr. Cohen, thank you very, very much for coming down. And we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
You have so many. How many of those people? You have different. People have very wide, differing estimations about how many people we could have on the Earth in the final analysis, don't they? And it varies widely. There's not a common understanding in terms of...
Well, they make different assumptions about what people want. Some assume that people will be happy to be vegetarians, and other people assume that everybody wants to live like an American, 25% of the calories from meat. Some people assume that what we can grow is fixed by what we've got now. Other people assume you can farm the Arctic. I mean, the assumptions are just very widely variable.
Yeah.
So it's...
So you, in a sense, you're really tapping into the basic question that's confronting us, and that notion of the population and the culture and the economic. And the economics is really. Do you think economics is the major question that's confronting us? I've seen increasing numbers of people. You think they're all interlinked together?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because I sometimes think that we have a technological capability and understanding that our economic assumptions don't allow us to realize. I don't know, but it just seems to me like that. If there's an area